Good afternoon. As Diederik said, I actually have a lot of jobs, but one of them is CEO, which is an organization where we do a lot of change management projects for organizations, private and public, and then we also run into the question of ecosystems. And at the university, the Vrije Universiteit in Amsterdam, I actually do research into these things. And I've been doing that for a long time. I think I started with looking at collaboration and first alliances somewhere at the end of the 1990s, did a lot of consulting in that area, and I've really seen the field evolve. And now we are onto ecosystems, and I thought as a topic today, I will raise the question of what is ecosystem management and what do ecosystem managers do? I think many of you perhaps will be surprised that there are ecosystem managers. So was I actually until I ran across one about 2 years ago. And I thought, okay, what is this? You know, is this really something new, or is it just alliance management, but we just put a different name tag on it? What do these men and women do who call themselves ecosystem managers? And that's part of the research that I'm going to show. I want to look at management and look at 3 elements: the design of ecosystems, the ecosystem management itself, and changing towards an ecosystem. And the last thing I only do briefly based on a case study, but I'd like to give you some idea about how you can change an existing organization towards a more ecosystem-based organization. Immediately, you can raise the question, is it possible to manage an ecosystem? I'll get back to that to the end, because you cannot really design it all. You know, you're very much dependent also on the other partners in your ecosystem, what they're willing to do. Often, it's very unexpected. You know, somebody shows up on your doorstep and says, here I am, and I've got a nice product or a nice idea or some nice and interesting knowledge, and can we work together? So you cannot really plan it, but there are things you can do to influence your ecosystem. Before I dive into the management, of course, we need to know, what is an ecosystem? And there, unfortunately, academia is not very precise. And practice is even less precise, because nowadays we put the name ecosystem on almost everything where people collaborate. Just some examples. Here I gathered all the partnerships announced over a 2-year period between organizations in the flat screen industry. So the producers of flat screens. And some will say, well, okay, that's an industry-level ecosystem. There are also organizations who say, okay, this is our ecosystem. So here I took all the partnerships of Eli Lilly of the past year, or actually it was 2 years ago, I think. And Eli Lilly, the pharmaceutical company, said, okay, this is our ecosystem. So that's, again, a different level of analysis. There's a third level. You know this one, the Westland, the big horticultural region in the Netherlands. I've done quite some research in that region. It's very interesting. All these growers of flowers and plants and vegetables, they collaborate, they develop new technologies, they exchange knowledge, they collaborate with universities and schools, they collaborate with their suppliers. That's an ecosystem on a regional level. And then there are ecosystems like the Microsoft ecosystem that we will hear about in a couple of minutes, the Google ecosystem, where we think about app developers that are part of that ecosystem. And those may even be 16-year-old girls or boys putting an app in some app store somewhere. So that notion of ecosystem, unfortunately, it's rather vague. The best definition I found, and that's the one that I'm going to use today, is this one by Williamson and Meyer. And they say an ecosystem is a network of organizations and individuals that co-evolve their capabilities and roles and align their investments to create additional value and improve efficiency. The key word here is the co-creation or co-evolution of capabilities, joint learning. If there's no co-evolution of capabilities or joint learning, then a relationship will be a transaction-based relationship. If I buy a loaf of bread at the baker in the morning, There really is no co-evolution of capability, even if I go to the same baker for 10 years. Because we don't develop very specific knowledge there. And I can easily switch and go to another baker, and it's no problem. But once we've built up knowledge together, it becomes much more difficult to change the partnership. And when that happens, then we're talking about an ecosystem. I'm not going to go through this slide in detail. This is really more the deep theorizing that kind of builds on that definition. This is just there to show that there's a lot of work being done in looking at ecosystems. But if you all boil it down to the core issue behind it, it is about this co-evolution of capabilities, this joint learning. That means that we're not just talking about networks that are transaction-based, but we're really talking about multilateral organizations that are learning together. So if we look then at the management, and we go a little bit more into the practical side of things, because the definition of ecosystems is very broad, management will also differ across all these ecosystems. It's quite different when you're looking at an ecosystem from the Microsoft perspective than when you're a plant grower here in the Westland area. There are different things you will do. So what are the main elements that determine what management should look like? Well, there are four. I think, first of all, is there a platform? Some ecosystems are really based on a very integrated platform. Like Facebook, for example, it has its own software, its own technology, its own databases. That's a very well-connected platform. If we look at an organization like Toyota, well, nowadays, they also have some kind of platform. That may be their engine technology and some design skills that they have. It's much less integrated than the Facebook platform. And if we look at the Westland area, there's no real platform there. There's nothing, not an integrated set of tools and resources that everybody can make use of. It's more knowledge spread across all the different participants. And so there's no platform there. And obviously, when there is a well-connected platform, you've got different management questions than when there's no well-connected platform. Is there a central player? Open source usually depends on volunteers. There may be some volunteers that are more important and powerful than others. There may be some organizations that also contribute to open source and that may have some influence. But clearly, that's quite a different situation than when you're, for example, Apple, and you're a very powerful player within your ecosystem. Other things you can do, other things you have to do to keep your ecosystem alive. And the next two questions are also very important. They're about openness. Openness for partners. Can anyone enter the ecosystem? If you want to put an app in the App Store at Apple, really anyone can do that. You just have to meet a couple of basic criteria, and you can find them all online. You know, you shouldn't engage in any criminal activity and those kind of things. And there's some demands that Apple asks you to do, but basically if you meet those demands, then you can contribute your app to the App Store. So it's very open. If you go to the Toyota ecosystem, it's very closed. Before you become a supplier to Toyota, it takes about 2 years. Because Toyota is really going to look at your quality, your organization, your innovation capability, your people, and it's a very high bar that they set to enter that ecosystem. But once you're in, then you're in, and everything's available for you. And finally, the role of IP. How open is IP? Is it closed, or is it shared with anyone? And here, the difference between Google and Apple is, I think, also very clear. Google is based on open source, on Android. Apple has its proprietary technology. Well, for Google, that also leads to some problems because there are now many versions of its operating system across the world, so you lose a lot of standardization. They try to roll that back and say to their collaborators in the ecosystem, okay, no, we want to go back to one version. And then the antitrust authority said, no, you can do that. Apple started out as a very closed system. But what's interesting is that due to competition, Apple has to open up more and more. If Google opens up to app developers, for example, makes more technology available, makes more knowledge available to them, then the app developers will say, okay, I'm going to work for the Google ecosystem and not for the Apple ecosystem. And that forces Apple slowly to open up. And that is a trend that we see. There are quite some ecosystems that start out closed, but that somehow over time, due to competition, are forced to open up. So I do believe that openness, to quite some extent, will be the future. Now, if we want to design ecosystems, I think we need to look at 4 different elements: scope, technology and IP, external relationships, and the internal organization. So if you want to set up an ecosystem, the first question is, who does what in the ecosystem? What do you want to get out of it, and which partners do you need to get to that? The second question is, what do we do with the knowledge or the technology and IP? Is that open, closed? What kind of knowledge do we want to get? Then how do we manage the external relationships? Do we want to have very tight long-term relationships, or should it be more fluid and dynamic? And how are we going to organize our own organization for that? And certainly for existing organizations that want to set up an ecosystem, that's a big challenge, because they're often based on silos, and it's very hard to collaborate across those silos in the organization, which often is necessary if you also want to function effectively in an external network. Just to show one ecosystem to illustrate those 4 design points, this is one from a couple of years ago, the Future Store initiative. It was run by Metro, it's a big supermarket chain in Germany. And they said, well, we want to develop new technology, a new standard for RFID in the supermarket sector. So RFID is a certain chip that you can, for example, put on a crate of Coca-Cola when it leaves the factory, and then you can trace how it is brought to the specific supermarket in your village. And when it's in the supermarket, the signal of the chip gets picked up, and then in your ERP system it registers as, okay, there's now a crate of Coca-Cola in your store. So that gives a lot of opportunity to optimize your logistics. Well, there wasn't a standard for that specific industry to do this, and Metro said, okay, let's do it, and let's build an ecosystem around it. So what is the scope? What do we need? Okay, we need people that know about software and hardware. We need people that know about RFID. We need to have a system integrator that ties it all together. We also need to have some brands that want to experiment with us, so Coca-Cola, and you can perhaps see Gillette for the razors that also wanted to experiment with that. Yeah, one part of the scope is also define some swim lanes. For example, SAP and Oracle are in the network, and they're big competitors. So one of the things for the scoping was that Metro said, okay, Oracle, you do the database, the ERP system is for SAP. And that's the way they looked at the scoping. Technology and IP, what do we want? They said from the beginning we wanted to be as open as possible. Because we want to set a standard, we don't have to make money out of that standard. We are not that type of company. And neither do the technology companies. They just want to open up the market. And the more supermarkets use this new standard, the more the Microsofts and the SAPs, etc., can also sell their software. So we open it up, and Metro even invites competitors to look into their stores about how they work with this new standard. How do we manage external relationships? Well, they were in a hurry, so they wanted to do it fast. They started the ecosystem in just a couple of months. And so they said, what we're going to do is we're just going to invite friends. We already work with a lot of technology companies, so instead of doing a formal search across the world, we're just going to invite companies we know very well, with people that we know we can work with, and that's it. And people that we don't work with, they're not really welcome. So it's a closed system. But they invited 50 companies to work on this. I think it also goes to the importance of the personal relationships to get an ecosystem going, which I think Kara will also be talking about undoubtedly better than that I can. The fourth element, how do we organize this internally? Metro, not a very flexible company, really, a supermarket chain, so the details count, the margins are low, everything has to be under 100% control. So it's not going to work to do this in our existing organization. So to say, okay, what do? We create a completely separate unit where we do this experiment. And the result of these design decisions actually was that within a couple of months, they had a store running, a future store running, where real-life customers could buy things, and it was chock full of all kinds of new technologies. And in the years after that, they kept experimenting, bringing in new things into that store. So a very smart design created some very fast results and a very strong ecosystem in only a couple of months. And it has been running for about 10 years, and only recently they scaled it down. You know, sometimes it ends and you're done innovating. So maybe you cannot guide all this in detail, but you can create some circumstances by that foster innovation in your ecosystem by thinking through in a smart way, okay, how are we going to design and organize it? You next get in a management phase. And this is based on research I've done with a student lately into what does this ecosystem manager do? Also, Metro had a person, they didn't call him the ecosystem manager, but he was an ecosystem manager. And here I compare it to the traditional alliance management role. Not all of you may be aware of what traditional alliance management is. Shame on you, because it's really very important to know that. I think it's very basic for ecosystems. I'll not go into detail about that. I'd just like to highlight a couple of points about what this ecosystem manager does. And we interviewed quite some of them. Some of them really had the title ecosystem manager on their business card. Some of them hadn't, but they were clearly doing it. An important one is that if we look at traditional alliance managers, they're usually tied to one firm. So I once knew very well the Microsoft IBM alliance manager. And he was really responsible for all the relationship between Microsoft and IBM here in the Netherlands. A very successful partnership. And his task was to really work with that specific partner. If we look at ecosystem managers, they don't have one partner they work for. They have several. And they're more busy with creating a very good climate in the ecosystem. So a climate that may mean that they ensure that the right technologies are available for developers, so that developers think, oh, it's fun to work in this ecosystem. It may be having the right information packages available for developers. It may also be maintaining the kind of culture that you want. Like in the Future Store initiative, one of the things they did was they invited everybody who worked for that Future Store to be present on site. Well, they didn't invite them, they ordered them to be on site, even though they could have done programming in Silicon Valley or in India. They said, no, we want you to be here. And they set a very strict deadline. They said, okay, we're going to open up in 3 months' time with this Future Store. And what that created was people working on a fun project, under time pressure, in the same location. It created a micro-culture in which everybody started helping everybody else. And that's what you want. And creating those kind of things, so maintaining the rules in your ecosystem, set an example for the type of culture you want to really get to that knowledge exchange and that innovation is an important part of what the ecosystem manager does. And some of the partners are also unknown. There are apps developers out there that you may want in your ecosystem and you don't know they exist. And still you have to find a way to bring them into your ecosystem because you want as many apps in your ecosystem as you possibly can, for example. They also set conditions for access and incentives to attract those new partners. So what type of partners do we want? What criteria do they meet? Important also is that they connect partners to each other. That was an interesting finding in our study. The traditional alliance manager just looks at that, well, let's say the Microsoft-IBM relationship, and that's it. In an ecosystem, the ecosystem manager says, okay, well, we are Microsoft, we work with IBM, we work with Oracle, and maybe I can connect IBM with Oracle in a certain way to create a new innovation. And maybe that's not interesting for me as IBM, but it will make my partner stronger, so it will make my ecosystem stronger, so in the end, I will also benefit somehow. In ecosystems, there are partners with whom you have a long-term relationship, but there may be also quite some with whom you have a short-term relationship. So the churn of partners, the rate at which partners enter the ecosystem and leave the ecosystem, is also something that these ecosystem managers look at. They need to manage that. So when too many partners leave, they have to find some way to bring other partners in. And I found even some ecosystem managers for whom that was a target. So there's just a number of partners. We know there's always a natural flow of partners in and out, but we need to have at least a minimum threshold. And you as an ecosystem manager are responsible to ensure that we at least have this number of partners. Governance is an interesting issue in ecosystems. In traditional governance structures between partners, there are often a lot of contracts involved and a lot of committees in which there are meetings. In ecosystems, it's quite different. We may have smart contracts. We may have some general guidelines saying, okay, you're allowed to do this, but you're not allowed to do this. Some permissions may be set, so some partners may actually make more use of your technology than other partners. But it's more a hands-off and managing things at arm's length than really via very complex contracts. Although, sometimes that may still be necessary and the big alliances can still be part of your ecosystem. So what do you measure and report? In a traditional alliance, often we look at the sales pipeline, or the innovation pipeline. How many possible innovations do we have in the pipeline? In ecosystems, we report much more on interactions and engagement. So how many interactions do we see on our site? And what's the level of engagement? So Facebook measures the number of people that go online on Facebook on a daily basis, compared to the number of people that only look at that on a monthly basis. You want people to interact on the site on a daily basis and not so much on a monthly basis. And if they see that number drop, that the number of people interacting on the site on a monthly basis, then the alarm flags go up. They say if there are too many of those people, we need to do something. Apparently, people are losing interest in us. Why is that? Where does it happen? Is this specific demographic or a region, or is it across the board that we see that? What are the actions we can take to increase that engagement level? The final one is, maybe I put it a bit too easily here, but certainly for the faster flowing partners, they come into the network and they leave. It's not very difficult to disengage from the ecosystem. Of course, for the partners where you have a longer running relationship, it may be very difficult to disengage from that. So that's kind of the new job of the ecosystem manager that we see emerging. And what I didn't put on here is the change aspect. And the final thing is a project I did for the tax agency here in the Netherlands and the Social Security Agency, and actually the Dutch Statistical Office. And already 10 years ago, they started to collaborate, because each of those parties goes to companies and they ask for the same thing. How many people do work there? What's their salary? What's their age? How long have they been working for you? So for companies, they had to deliver the same information 3 times. They said, okay, we can make that more efficient. Let's do that in one time. But that means that the parties have to collaborate. It failed miserably for the first 2 years. They couldn't connect the databases. The standards weren't okay. It was one big mess. And they also couldn't collaborate. They improved that over time, and they actually became very successful. And so about 2 years ago, I said, okay, now you're optimizing among the 2 or 3 of you. Maybe you should now start thinking about being an ecosystem, because there are many partners outside of the 3 of you that also have an impact on how you can perform. So what we did is we gathered a lot of people that we thought were part of their ecosystem, and together with those people, we created this picture. I know the letters are too small, but it's just to give you an idea of what we did. And we created this picture and said, okay, this is apparently the ecosystem around this income tax chain. And doing this actually started kind of the change in these very traditional organizations, because now they were thinking on a completely different level. They said, okay, maybe there are some partners in our ecosystem that can help us solve problems. One of the problems is that a lot of organizations give the wrong social security number to the tax agency. That's either because a new employee gives the wrong number or somebody types it in the wrong way. That creates a tremendous cost, because it takes about 2 or 3 months before they find out that the social security number is wrong. And then they have to change everything, all the salaries and social premiums and what have you, for 3 months back. So it's a very costly mistake. So one of the things that came out of it, talking to people in salary administration, is, okay, can you give us better information about how we should handle this problem? First of all, we need to understand the importance of it, but also, can't we make a tool, for example, to check social security numbers, whether they exist or not? Well, then you run a bit in privacy issues, but they're looking at that, how can we solve that? And that's a new idea that comes out of the ecosystem. So in doing this, we had a couple of benefits. So we did it with a number of people, and I think I mentioned already most of this, but the most important thing is that just drawing this picture helped to create a new mindset, not just in the tax office and in the Social Security Agency, but also in the many partners that either use their data or deliver data. And now some groups come up around this income tax chain that are collaborating to solve the various issues. So you actually make use of outside knowledge to solve your own problem. So that's a great thing. And it's a very simple way. We are just drawing things on a whiteboard and say, which partners do you think are part of the ecosystem? What are the relations between them? And before you know it, you've got a great conversation that can last for a day. And we had that with a couple of different groups, and a lot of new ideas came up from that. So that's a beginning of a change towards ecosystem thinking. Wrapping up, in design, can we manage ecosystems? Partly. There are certainly elements in design that stimulate collaboration and that hinder it. So think about that. In the end, it's still about other organizations that will have to want to work with you. Managing, there are quite a number of tools and approaches have been developed already, but they're never very directive. So it's more you can influence it, but it's not the top-down management that we had previously. And if we look at change, I think an important thing is that also for existing organizations, and where you wouldn't expect it, very traditional organization like the tax agency, you can certainly make steps in the right direction by a relatively simple approach, like creating this picture together with partners. What also worked very well here was they already knew how to collaborate. They had learned it over time. And that collaborative skill that they had, they can really apply here in the ecosystem context that they are building at the moment. I won't say they're there yet. They're not creating or not joint learning, co-evolving capabilities with all these organizations, but certainly with a lot more than they did 2 years ago. With that, I'd like to wrap it up. I think we have some time for questions.
On one of your slides, you had the importance of the climate ecosystem manager. What's the relationship of leadership, and specifically leadership style, on that climate that's being created?
Yeah. So if we look at that Future Store example, they had to find a manager for that. And they knew that the normal Metro manager was not the good leader for such an ecosystem. So they looked for the weirdest guy they could find in the organization, and they put him in charge. And that was somebody who wasn't as directive and controlling as all the other managers were. So it's really focusing on what we nowadays call collaborative leadership. Maybe he was more a first among equals than really the boss of the ecosystem. He was very sensitive also to smaller partners about communicating with them, because a lot of people came with initiatives for innovation. Of course, not everything can be implemented, but then he was very sensitive and said, okay, I'll go back to you, I'll explain you why we cannot implement it or why we cannot implement it now. So it's really that feeling for what is a relationship and how do you manage that, I think is very important for a collaborative leader.
Albert-Jan Pomper, ASML. I wonder, is there any relationship between the ecosystems and the outcome of innovation, the success of innovations, the quality of innovations?
There's some research on that suggests yes. But as an academic, I always say we need more research. But it's not always the case, and it depends a lot, actually, and that's what we're finding out on these structural characteristics and the relation between the people. There are some ecosystems that look great on paper, but the people just don't connect and don't trust each other, and therefore they do not exchange knowledge. And then, of course, you're not going to get much innovation. And then it all looks great on paper, but in practice it doesn't work. So I would say yes, but certain conditions need to be met. So the structure needs to fit, but also the people need to have the right mindset here. And often a lot of companies are also still very controlling about what people are allowed to share with the ecosystem and what they are not allowed to share. And the more controlling you are, the less innovative ideas you're going to get.
Hi, I was wondering because co-creation and co-evolution is the key for ecosystem. Do you think the early PPS constructions maybe are ecosystems too?
PPS, the early PPS constructions are the ecosystem.
The private partnerships?
Yeah, I know what you're talking about, and my answer will be definitely no. It depends on what you mean with the early PPS constructions. I never liked those very much. I think there's also been a lot of evolvement in how public-private partnerships are structured. The first time I was part of a PPS construction, we're talking about end of the 1990s, it wasn't structured right. The organizations didn't understand how to collaborate. They collaborated on paper. It was the government saying, okay, there's money. And then there came 3 companies and they say, okay, so on paper we're going to collaborate, but as soon as the money is there, we're going to split the money and each is going to go his own way. That has happened a lot. It's still happening a lot in EU projects. I'm very critical of that. There are other PPS projects where I've seen it quite differently. I was involved in one only 2 years ago, actually in the horticulture industry. It was really fun working together with organizations, creating new scenarios for the future. And there, the government was involved, I was involved from the university side, and there were a lot of organizations, even small growers of plants were involved. And there, I think the funding was nice, but there was a lot of fun in the innovation there. And I think that we got much further in co-creating there than in the earlier PPS projects.